Hey folks, welcome to TheyMightBeRacing.com. Today, what you're looking at in front of me is a piece of hardline off my 53 Studebaker Champion. Now, it becomes an inevitable point that eventually you'll need to bend, flare, and fabricate your own hardline because for whatever reason it may not be available anymore. My Studebaker is a perfect example of this. There are a couple of tools and items that you need when you want to do your own lines. For starters, you need a flaring tool set. And so this one is a basic double flare tool set. You'll need a pipe cutter to be able to cut your pipe bender to bend your pipe, and in some cases one of these finer toothed ones will work. You'll want an angled protractor to be able to measure your curves, some sand to fill in the pipe when you're doing the bends, and finally some string. Now the way that this works, you can pretend like for the moment that this is on a car, so you can do this either in situ or on the bench, is you take your twine, and what I always like to do is leave about a ½ inch hanging off the end of the line, and you run it along the outside of the pipe, tape it down using painter's tape till you get to the other end. Then you go ahead, once you've got it here, just cut yourself another ½ inch. Now I've already pre-measured this particular piece, and here I've got my length of twine that covers the distance of this particular piece of pipe. So the first thing that we need to do in order to start bending our pipe for this is to cut a fresh piece of stock. Now normally I would not recommend using steel, pure steel line. This is what OEM manufacturers used to use. It rusts really easily. However, I live in Arizona. We don't get rain. Things don't rust. So, for a while I can get away with it. Now, I normally buy my stock steel in coils. You can also get hardline in straight pieces as well. The only real difficulty in dealing with the coiled stuff is obviously you have to uncoil it before you use it. So, at this state, what you do is then you take your pre-measured twine, tape it off on the end of your steel. Now keep in mind that we did over measure just a little bit, so we have some extra. Run that length of twine down until you get to the end. Now that gives us our point at which we're going to cut the steel. So I'm going ahead and put a little score mark on my steel line right here. So that score line tells me where to cut. And because this is tubing, you can't just cut it with, a pair of pliers or something like that. You need a proper tubing cutter. This one is a little bit bigger than what you would see in an auto parts store. It's actually for cutting, or I originally bought it for cutting copper pipe in the house. But you open it up, fit the steel in, make sure to get it at your score mark. And then from there, you simply spin it around. And as you spin, you tighten it a little bit each time. Now you'll want to check the end for burrs and for roughness. And if it has any, you need to clean those off. But at this point, you now have your piece of steel that we're going to bend to match up. Now, if I were doing this in an in situ fashion on the car, the trick is that you can't really take the line off. So what you have to do is determine what all your angles are. Now this particular piece is fairly simple. It's got one bend here, and then it's got another bend here, and they're roughly 90-degree bends. Using your protractor, what you can do is put it center in center, and then this particular one has a locking mechanism, so you tighten it up and it locks the measurement. And you can see here that my measure is almost perfectly 90 degrees. Now, one thing to keep in mind, however, is that we're not always working in a flat space. Tubing and cars are three-dimensional, so you have to make sure to account for any other bends in the line. Now, most of these bends are just kind of post-fabrication installation bends, so I don't think they're correct. But I do have one more bend here, and I can tell just by looking at it, it's pretty much a 90-degree bend. It's actually probably about somewhere around almost 100 degrees. So, now that we know what our bend angles are, and we can use our protractor, also the measuring aspect of it, to figure out how far into the line it is. One other approach you can take is to compare the flared line to your existing line, capture the center of the bend, and then score that bend center. Now, as I said, we know that this bend is just a little bit shy of 90. Really want to do, before you start doing any serious bending, is cap off one end with tape, and then using a funnel, in my case a piece of paper, you want to fill your pipe with a material that will keep it from crimping on you during the bending process. In this particular case, I've got some sand here, so I'm going to use that. It may take a minute or two for it to fill up. Then once it's full, go ahead and cap this end as well. So what that'll do is that sand inside the pipe will keep the pipe from crimping on you during your bending process. So we'll go back, find our score again, put the pipe on the bender, and pull it towards me. Here I've got my 90-degree bend. So that's my first bend. Always want to take your pipe, compare your bends to the existing one, make sure they're more or less the same. You can see that mine is slightly sharper of an angle, so you've got your bends in. And you go through and you do this throughout the entire piece. So now that I've got all the pipe bent correctly, it's all set up, the first thing you do is make sure to put your nuts on the line before you even think about flaring anything. I can't count the number of times that I've flared line over the year only to realize that, oh crap, there's no nut on there. So, put the nut on there, you set the flaring tool. Now this happens to be a double flare on this particular setup. So the first thing you do is you set your double flare piece on there to measure the height correctly, tighten everything up. Now this inserts into the pipe, and you go ahead and you set this over. And what will occur is that the compression here will force the tubing out. Now this particular one is a 1/2 inch. I tend to use a stubby wrench on these to make sure I don't over torque things while I'm tightening them up. After tightening that down and forcing the flare, you can go ahead and release. And you should be able to double check it. Pull the piece out, and you should see it pressed out to the edges here. If it's not pressed out to the edges, go ahead and reseat it. Out. To set the second flare, pull out that piece. Tighten up your flaring tool, and what this will do is this will crimp that flare down into the line. You see it's crimped down. Go ahead and loosen the whole thing up. Take our line out and see how it looks. It down. Prepare your flares. You can see that this flare is just as good as the old one, so this end is good to go. It's time to do the other end.